Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. Billings, himself a veteran of the war, offers detailed descriptions of camp life, hardships, food, equipment, and the camaraderie shared among soldiers. This version has been adapted to suit the modern listener, ensuring its timeless stories and insights remain accessible and engaging today. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. The indiscretions of soldiers during the war and the punishments they endured have not been detailed extensively in popular histories. Perhaps this omission exists because many veterans still harbor unresolved grievances about the punishments they faced. Even now, some veterans, though not openly hostile, remain embittered towards old commanders over what they perceive as past injustices. These grievances, whether real, imagined, or a mixture of both, linger when they might be better replaced by more constructive or enjoyable pursuits. While I cannot enumerate every possible offense or punishment, as these vary depending on the commanding officer and the situation, I will attempt to cover those that resonate with a shared experience. Common offenses included drunkenness, leaving camp without leave, insubordination, showing disrespect to superior officers, missing roll call without permission, causing disturbances after taps, sitting down while on guard duty, gambling, and leaving one's guard post without relief. To elaborate, soldiers were not permitted to leave camp without a pass or written permit from their commanding officer. However, many left for short periods, gambling on not being noticed or reported. In some companies, a roll call would be ordered unexpectedly to catch those absent without permission. Disrespect towards a superior officer took many forms, including talking back in strong language, failing to salute, or refusing to acknowledge them while on duty. The other offenses are largely self-explanatory. Punishments were as varied as the dispositions of the officers who issued them. Early in a regiment's history, there was usually a guardhouse or tent where daily guards gathered when off post during their 24-hour duty. Offenders were confined there for varying lengths of time, a common punishment for drunkenness. While this penalty might seem mild, soldiers disliked the loss of freedom and isolation from their comrades. Being absent without leave, whether from camp or roll call, was punished in numerous ways, but there was no universal standard. Many organizations maintained a blacklist, a record of those who violated camp rules. Names on this list were frequently called upon for the most disagreeable tasks around camp, such as policing the grounds, digging new sinks, latrines, or filling in old ones. For cavalry and artillery units, burying dead horses or cleaning the picket ropes where animals were tied were common punishments. Membership on this list was particularly galling because tasks performed as punishment were in addition to regular duties. This system of punishment was not typically used by officers out of personal spite but rather to enforce discipline and benefit the camp. Officers aimed to combine punishment with practical utility. However, some officers preferred punishments that inflicted physical pain. These included bucking and gagging, forcing offenders to stand on barrels for hours, or having them wear an inverted barrel with a hole cut for the head, creating a humiliating wooden overcoat. Other punishments involve tying a heavy stick of wood across a soldier's back with arms extended horizontally, strapping them to a tall wooden horse, or enforcing knapsack drill, where soldiers marched while carrying knapsacks filled with bricks or stones. An anecdote from the Gulf Department illustrates one such punishment. A captain in General Phelps' brigade had a soldier march up and down the company street carrying a brick-filled knapsack. When General Phelps discovered this, he summoned the captain and firmly ordered him to release the soldier, reprimanding him for such misuse of authority. One regiment erected a high platform, 25 to 30 feet tall, where offenders were isolated, exposed to the elements, with a guard posted below to prevent communication. Another method was to tie soldiers by their thumbs with arms fully extended or confine them in a sweat box, a narrow structure just large enough for a man to stand in. Some had boards strapped to their backs with their offenses written on them, forced to parade through camp as a public spectacle. In the artillery, offenders were often tied to the spare wheel carried on caisson. In the cavalry, soldiers might be made to carry their pack saddles for extended periods, a burdensome punishment. In some cases, soldiers were required to carry heavy logs on their shoulders as a form of public humiliation and exertion. I recall one soldier punished in this manner who vowed never to perform another duty for his company. He reported sick every day, and though the surgeon found no illness, he refused to work. By starving himself, he eventually appeared ill enough to be discharged, and upon returning home, he proudly boasted of his defiance. Such punishments, while ostensibly meant to enforce discipline, often bred resentment and showcased the extremes to which military authority could be exercised. Sometimes, soldiers were assigned double guard duty as punishment for an omission or act while on guard. This punishment required the soldier to serve 4 hours on duty and only 2 hours off, reversing the usual schedule. Offenses that could lead to this included failing or refusing to salute a superior officer, being improperly equipped, leaving their assigned post without proper relief, or neglecting their duty when the grand rounds appeared. When non-commissioned officers committed offenses, they were punished by being reduced to the ranks. Gambling, though prohibited in some units, was tolerated in others and practiced by both officers and privates. In at least one command where gambling was banned, enlisted men caught in the act faced the humiliating punishment of having half their heads shaved. Talking back, or responding insolently to a superior officer, was another common cause of punishment. In some regiments, absolute obedience was strictly enforced, no matter the rank of the officer, from colonel to the lowest-ranking corporal. Under such discipline, soldiers were expected to follow commands without question, reducing them to mere puppets in what some officers saw as a perfectly functioning military machine. However, the effectiveness and morale of such regiments depended heavily on the character of their leaders. If a commanding officer combined fairness and justice with strict discipline, the regiment could excel. Unfortunately, this ideal was not always realized. Many leaders became tyrannical or abusive, either due to their temperament or because they had suddenly been granted authority over others. Alcohol abuse among officers further undermined their effectiveness as leaders. At the beginning of the war, many officers were appointed based on personal influence or wealth rather than merit. As a result, some earned their commissions through connections rather than battlefield bravery. For example, men with skills in managing mule trains or overseeing kitchens often secured positions of authority while deserving soldiers, who had proven their courage, were overlooked. For many enlisted men, submitting to the authority of unqualified or socially inferior officers was humiliating. It was especially bitter when they were punished or reprimanded by individuals they did not respect. This humiliation grew as they were often ordered to remain silent and accept unjust treatment. It was not uncommon for disgruntled soldiers to threaten officers who mistreated them. Many claimed they would shoot their commanding officers during the next engagement. However, when battles occurred, such threats rarely materialized. Soldiers had enough enemies to fight without turning on their own officers. Similarly, some soldiers swore they would settle scores with certain officers once they returned home, but these threats were seldom carried out. Non-commissioned officers, caught in the uncomfortable position of mediators between officers and privates, often bore the brunt of soldier dissatisfaction. Occasionally, they were invited to strip off their chevrons and settle disputes physically. However, such invitations were rarely accepted, not necessarily out of fear, but because it would undermine their authority and position. In contrast, some regiments fostered a more relaxed atmosphere, where social interaction between officers and enlisted men was common during off-duty hours. Despite this informality, these regiments maintained discipline and were ready to follow their leaders into battle. Officers in these units led by example, treating their men fairly while demanding high standards. Their leadership built trust and camaraderie, transforming their regiments into highly effective military forces. In such units, punishments were rare, as mutual respect and self-discipline often replaced the need for harsh measures. It is important to note that punishments were far more common during the first 2 years of the war. At that time, soldiers were still adjusting to the demands of military life. By the later years, as campaigning became more continuous and both officers and privates shared hardships, the rigors of service fostered mutual understanding. Promotions from the ranks further narrowed the gap between officers and enlisted men, strengthening bonds. As a result, minor infractions were often overlooked or dealt with lightly. At the beginning of the war, many generals were deeply concerned that certain actions of the common soldier might offend the Southern people. This led to a practice where any reported losses, such as stolen chickens, borrowed beehives, or burnt fences, had to be thoroughly investigated. Subordinates were ordered to search for evidence that could identify the culprits, and the offenders were often required to make full restitution for the property taken. During this period, the government and its leading officers, both military and civil, appeared almost apologetic for invading southern territory, seemingly hesitant and seeking an honorable way to disengage from the conflict. However, by the end of the Peninsular Campaign, this overly cautious approach had largely disappeared. By then, wandering pigs, henhouses, wooden fences, and straw stacks were often viewed as fair game for Union soldiers. Punishments for taking such items became less common, and officers, as a rule, began to develop a strategic nearsightedness when it came to identifying culprits. Drumming out of camp was a punishment reserved for cowardice. If a soldier's courage failed in the face of the enemy, he was stripped of his uniform and equipment at the earliest opportunity after the battle. He was then marched through camp, flanked by guards with bayonets, while the fife and drum corps played the Rogue's March. Throughout this humiliating procession, the disgraced soldier faced hoots and jeers from his former comrades. There were no restrictions on the language used to revile him, and soldiers often exhausted their vocabularies in insulting the man. After this public shaming, he was marched beyond the camp's boundaries and released. Although this punishment may seem light for such a serious offense, it was considered highly disgraceful. No man wanted to be branded a coward or expelled from the army in such a dishonorable way, with the incident recorded alongside the heroic deeds of his comrades in the regimental rolls. If found within the camp afterward, he was liable to execution. Despite the gravity of this punishment, many soldiers deserving of such treatment escaped it. Threatening or assaulting an officer was another serious offense, often resulting in a court-martial. Soldiers found guilty of such acts were sentenced to confinement in the guardhouse, hard labor at places like the Rip Raps or Dry Tortugas, or to wearing a ball and chain around their ankles for a set period. These offenses were sometimes committed under the influence of alcohol but were just as often the result of temper or frustration over what the soldier perceived as unreasonable demands from his superiors. Sleeping on duty at a post of danger was punishable by death. However, it remains uncertain whether this extreme penalty was ever carried out in the Union Army. One well-known story involves a young soldier who was pardoned by President Lincoln after his mother made a heartfelt plea on his behalf. While it is a touching tale, it is unclear if it is based on real events. In contrast, the penalty for desertion, execution by firing squad, was a grim reality. Such executions were not uncommon but did little to stem the tide of desertion. Reports indicate that, at any given time, up to 1/4 of the Army of the Potomac soldiers were absent without leave after its organization by General McClellan. The first execution of a deserter that I witnessed took place around mid-October 1863. At the time, I was part of General Sickles' 3rd Corps, temporarily attached to General Birney's 1st Division, stationed near Fairfax Station on the Army's extreme left flank. The condemned soldier belonged to a Pennsylvania regiment and had repeatedly deserted. He was also accused of providing the enemy with information that led to the capture of a wagon train. The entire division was ordered to witness the execution. The soldiers were arranged in 2 double ranks, forming 3 sides of a rectangle. The outer ranks faced inward, while the inner ranks faced outward. Between these lines, the prisoner was forced to march with his head lowered. The somber procession included the provost marshal, who led the march on horseback, followed by the band playing Playel's Hymn, a tune that has since become associated in my mind with immense sadness. Next came 12 armed guards deployed diagonally across the open end of the rectangle to prevent any escape attempt. Behind them marched 4 soldiers carrying the prisoner's coffin, followed by the condemned man himself, flanked by a chaplain and 2 guards. Finally, a firing squad of 12 soldiers followed. 11 of their muskets were loaded with live rounds, while the 12th contained a blank cartridge. Since the weapons were prepared and mixed beforehand, no one in the squad knew which musket held the blank, offering a faint hope to each man that he might not be responsible for the fatal shot. An additional reserve firing squad of 6 soldiers marched behind, ready to act if the first group failed. After completing the slow march, the prisoner was seated on his coffin near the grave prepared for him at the open end of the rectangle. The chaplain offered a prayer and spoke briefly with the condemned man before stepping back. The provost marshal then blindfolded the prisoner with a handkerchief and read aloud the order for execution. At his signal, the firing squad discharged their weapons, and the soldier slumped backward onto his coffin, his life extinguished. His arms flailed briefly in the air, but he made no further movement. A nearby surgeon confirmed his death. Afterward, the division marched past the body and off the field, bringing the somber scene to an end. I later witnessed another deserter from the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps meet his end in a similar manner near Petersburg in the summer of 1864. These were the only executions of this kind that I personally saw, though others occurred near my camp. By 1864 and 1865, the artillery was brigaded separately, and artillerymen were no longer required to attend executions held in the infantry. One notable case involved a deserter and spy executed near Indianapolis in 1863. He had enlisted in the 71st Indiana Infantry, deserted shortly afterward, and joined the enemy, only to later reappear within Union lines as a Confederate spy. He was captured and brought to General Henry B. Carrington, commanding the military district at the time. Despite his adamant protests of innocence, a thorough search of his clothing and belongings was conducted. His coat was cut into strips, and all his garments were examined without yielding any incriminating evidence. Standing naked before his captors, he was given a new suit of clothes and triumphantly demanded his release. However, General Carrington, insisting on thoroughness, noticed that one of the trouser hems was stiffer than the other. Upon further inspection, he discovered a pass from Confederate General Kirby Smith carefully sewn into the fabric. At this revelation, the man fell to his knees, begging for mercy. He was court-martialed and sentenced to be hanged, as hanging was the prescribed punishment for treason. However, General Carrington decided the man would instead be shot, believing the execution would serve as a stronger deterrent against the rampant desertion occurring at the time. Normally, the firing squad was selected from the deserter's own company, but in this case, the entire company requested to participate, outraged by his betrayal. Their request was denied, and a detail of 15 men was assigned. Unlike the usual practice, where one or more muskets would be loaded with blank cartridges to diffuse responsibility, each man loaded his weapon himself. When the execution was carried out, all 15 bullets struck their target, proving each man felt it his duty to fire. As solemn and shocking as these executions were, I doubt they significantly discouraged desertion among the rank and file. The opportunities for escape were abundant, and any soldier willing to desert could usually find a way. In one case, a man in my company used civilian clothes, brought to him by his wife, to facilitate his escape. However, such precautions were not always necessary for desertion to succeed. Not all deserters were executed. The death penalty was inconsistently applied, sometimes ignored entirely, and then reintroduced during periods of increased desertion. Desertion was particularly rampant in 1864 when many town and city governments hired foreigners, offering large bounties to fill enlistment quotas. These so-called bounty jumpers enlisted solely to collect the bounty and deserted soon afterward, often before even reaching the field. Many of these individuals would then travel to another state to enlist again, repeating the scheme and earning hundreds of dollars before being caught. Some were eventually apprehended and punished. I knew of 3 men shot together, each having taken bounties 3 times before being captured. A significant number of these bounty jumpers came from Canada. To prevent further desertions, reliable troops had to be assigned to escort these recruits to their respective regiments. Most recaptured deserters were sentenced to hard labor on government projects, confined in penitentiaries like those in Albany or the old Capitol Prison in Washington, or sent to places like the Rip Raps near Fort Monroe. On March 11, 1865, President Lincoln issued a proclamation offering a full pardon to all deserters who returned to their units within 60 days, provided they served out their full term and made up for lost time. Many took advantage of this act of clemency, seeking to restore their honor and leave the service with a clean record. This act of forgiveness, emblematic of Lincoln's unparalleled magnanimity, was likely undeserved by many of its beneficiaries. Hanging was the prescribed punishment for certain military crimes, including desertion to the enemy. In the autumn of 1864, near Fort Welch, I saw 3 soldiers from the 6th Corps hang simultaneously for this offense. Unlike the executions of deserters by firing squad, this event was conducted with less ceremony. The condemned men, all foreigners, were transported to the gallows in an ambulance, attended by a chaplain and guarded closely on all sides. Though no formal order was issued for troops to witness the event, thousands from nearby camps gathered along the route and around the gallows. The men were hanged without eliciting any sympathy from their comrades. In April 1864, I witnessed another hanging, this time on the plains of Stevensburg. The condemned man belonged to the 2nd Division of my corps. Most of the corps, numbering 27,000 strong, watched the execution. Unfortunately, the provost marshal botched the hanging. The rope was too long, causing the man's feet to touch the ground when the trapdoor fell. This forced the provost marshal to manually hold the man aloft until he died, likely from strangulation rather than a broken neck. The man was so emaciated that it's doubtful his neck would have broken even under ideal conditions. According to the Adjutant General's report in 1870, a total of 121 men were executed during the war. This number represents only a small fraction of those eligible for the death penalty under military law. At the beginning of the war, many generals were overly concerned that the actions of common soldiers might offend the Southern people. This caution encouraged Southerners to report every missing chicken, every borrowed beehive, and every rail burned to Union headquarters. Subordinates were then ordered to conduct thorough investigations to identify and punish the culprits. They were often required to provide restitution for the value of the property taken. At the time, our government and its leading military and civilian officers seemed almost apologetic for invading Southern territory. It sometimes felt as though they were only waiting for a proper excuse to withdraw honorably from the conflict. However, by the time the Peninsular Campaign ended, this overly cautious handling of the enemy had stopped. Wandering pigs, hen houses, fences, and straw stacks were increasingly seen as fair game, or perquisites of the Union Army. Punishments for appropriating such items became far less frequent, and the difficulty of finding the culprits grew, as officers became strategically nearsighted when such issues arose. Drumming a soldier out of camp was a punishment reserved for cowards. When a man displayed cowardice in the face of the enemy, he was stripped of his uniform and equipment. Then, accompanied by guards on either side and 4 soldiers behind with bayonets fixed, he was marched through camp. A fife and drum corps followed, playing the Rogue's March. As he passed through, the disgraced soldier was jeered and ridiculed by his former comrades. No restrictions were placed on the language of the spectators, and the man endured a barrage of insults. Once his shameful tour of camp was complete, he was marched beyond the lines and set free. Although this may seem like a light punishment for such a grave offense, it was considered deeply disgraceful. The label of coward and the dishonorable record marked on his roll alongside the heroic deeds of his peers ensured that this punishment carried lasting stigma. If the man was found in camp again, he could face the death penalty. Sometimes, private soldiers assaulted or threatened officers. These offenses were treated seriously and often resulted in court-martial trials. Offenders were commonly sentenced to confinement in a guardhouse, hard labor at government facilities like the Rip Raps or the Dry Tortugas, or imprisonment in penitentiaries. In some cases, they were forced to wear a ball and chain attached to their ankle for a specified period. Such acts of violence often occurred under the influence of alcohol or in moments of anger and frustration over perceived injustices. The punishment for sleeping on duty at a post of danger was death. However, whether this penalty was ever carried out is uncertain. One well-known story involves President Lincoln pardoning a young soldier for this offense after the man's mother made a heartfelt appeal. Whether this account is true or fictional is unclear, but it reflects the moral dilemmas faced during the war. Desertion, however, was a different matter. It was a serious offense, punishable by death. I recall witnessing my first execution of a deserter in October 1863, while serving in Sickles' 3rd Corps. The guilty man was a Pennsylvanian who had deserted multiple times and was accused of providing information to the enemy that led to the capture of a wagon train. The division was assembled to witness the execution, forming a large rectangle around the site. The prisoner, accompanied by guards and a chaplain, was marched through the ranks. A coffin was carried ahead of him, and the solemn procession was accompanied by the mournful strains of Pleyel's hymn. Once the prisoner reached the open end of the rectangle, he was seated on the coffin, blindfolded, and read the sentence aloud. The firing squad, composed of 12 soldiers, 11 with live ammunition and 1 with a blank cartridge, then carried out the execution. The man fell back lifeless onto his coffin, and the troops were marched away. In the summer of 1864, I witnessed another deserter's execution near Petersburg. Though the details were similar, such scenes never grew less solemn or unsettling. Desertion remained widespread despite the death penalty, as the opportunity to flee was abundant. Some deserters even received help from family members, as in the case of a man in my company whose wife provided him with civilian clothing to aid his escape. Not all deserters were executed. Many were sentenced to hard labor on government projects or imprisoned in penitentiaries. In March 1865, President Lincoln issued a proclamation offering full pardon to deserters who returned to their units within 60 days. This act of mercy allowed many to redeem themselves and finish their service honorably. Hanging was another punishment reserved for serious crimes, such as deserting to the enemy. In the fall of 1864, I saw 3 men hanged near Fort Welch for enlisting in the Confederate Army after deserting from the Union. Unlike the solemn processions for deserters shot by firing squads, these executions were marked by less ceremony. The condemned men, all foreigners, were transported to the gallows in an ambulance and executed without significant public attention. The most gruesome execution I witnessed occurred in April 1864, on the plains of Stevensburg. A man was hanged in full view of the corps, which was then 27,000 strong. The provost marshal botched the hanging by using a rope that was too long, causing the man's feet to touch the ground. The officer had to manually hold the rope taut until the man suffocated. It was a horrifying scene, and the failure to ensure a swift death added unnecessary cruelty to the punishment. According to the Adjutant General's report from 1870, 121 men were executed during the war. While this number is small compared to the total number of soldiers who served, it underscores the harsh realities of maintaining discipline in the Army. That concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.